My name is Matthew Rinaldi, and on April 17, 2022, my life changed forever. I had spent most of my years serving quietly as a parish deacon in a small town outside Florence, Italy. Faith had always been a part of my life, but I never thought I would witness something so profound, so heavy with God's presence, that it would leave me unable to explain it with words. That Easter weekend, I found myself in Rome, called there almost by instinct, like a pull I couldn't ignore. It was a decision that would place me at the heart of something sacred, something I would carry for the rest of my days. The city felt different that weekend, as if all of Rome was holding its breath. The Vatican itself seemed cloaked in a silence that wasn't empty, but full of prayer, full of expectation, full of something none of us could name. Everywhere I went, from the crowded streets to the hushed corners of cathedrals, people moved with a quiet reverence, a deep knowing that this Easter would not be like the others. Even the tourists who usually flooded the squares seemed different, almost as if they, too, had been touched by the invisible weight hanging in the air. We all sensed it without needing to say a word. Pope Francis was nearing the end of his journey. I remember standing near St. Peter's Square that morning, the stone under my feet warm from the early sun. I watched the windows of the papal apartments, almost afraid to blink in case I missed something. Inside, we later learned, Pope Francis was battling not just the frailty of his body, but the calling of his spirit. His aides had pleaded with him to stay inside, to rest, to let the doctors handle things. But that was never who he was. Even with trembling hands and fading breath, he understood that this day, this moment, belonged not to him, but to all of us. Slowly, with every ounce of strength he could gather, Pope Francis made his way to the balcony. It wasn't just a walk across a room. It was a journey of faith, of sacrifice, of love poured out until the very last drop. There was no speech written for him that day, no notes tucked into his robe. He wasn't there to speak grand words or offer political statements. He was there simply to be seen, to remind us that even when the body gives way, the spirit endures. When the balcony doors finally opened, the crowd seemed to inhale all at once. I'll never forget the way the sunlight touched him, bathing him in this golden, almost otherworldly glow. He looked frail, yes, but there was also this incredible peace that radiated from him, stronger than any weakness in his bones. He gripped the railing, steadying himself, but it wasn't fear that made him hold on. It was reverence. Reverence for God, for the people, for the sacredness of that last, silent moment. In front of him stretched thousands upon thousands of faces, turned upward in complete stillness. No one shouted, no one cheered. Instead, it felt like the entire world had agreed to hold a collective holy silence. Flags moved gently in the breeze like whispered prayers, and somewhere, hymns began to rise and fall in the air, soft and steady like breathing. I could feel it deep in my chest, the undeniable sense that heaven was closer to us than it had ever been before. As I watched him, tears filled my eyes without warning. It wasn't sadness that made me cry. It was something deeper, something I didn't even have words for. Pope Francis didn't have to say a single thing for all of us to understand what he meant. His presence alone spoke louder than any sermon ever could. It was as if his soul was reaching out to each of ours, one by one, binding us together in a moment that felt timeless. I noticed his hands trembling slightly as he lifted them, offering a simple blessing over the crowd. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was small, almost tender, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of love and service. The silence deepened around us, not uncomfortable, but sacred, like being wrapped in the softest kind of prayer. Every heartbeat, every breath in that square seemed to synchronize with his. We weren't just witnessing history, we were living inside a holy moment, stitched together by invisible hands. Then, just as slowly as he had come, Pope Francis began to step back from the balcony. His aide, a young man whose eyes were filled with unspoken grief, reached out gently to guide him. None of us moved. None of us spoke. We just stood there, holding on to that last glimpse, trying to etch it into our hearts forever. Even as he disappeared from sight, the presence he left behind was almost heavier than when he stood there. A lingering holiness that clung to the air and filled every empty space. After he vanished from the balcony, the crowd still didn't break apart. We stayed there, shoulder to shoulder, as if moving would shatter what had just happened. Some people wept openly. Others dropped to their knees right where they stood, praying with a kind of desperation and devotion I had never seen before. I stayed frozen in place too, clutching my rosary so tightly that later I would find the imprint of the beads pressed into my palm. None of us wanted to leave because deep down we all knew we had just said goodbye. Eventually, I made my way back through the streets of Rome, but everything looked different. The colors were muted, the sounds were softer, and the city itself seemed to walk alongside me in mourning. I wandered without direction, not wanting to return to my hotel room, not wanting to break whatever was still stirring inside me. I ended up near a small chapel tucked away between two narrow streets, a place I had never seen before. I slipped inside and found a pew near the back, the coolness of the stone grounding me as I sank into prayer. I don't know how long I stayed there, maybe hours, maybe minutes. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. I prayed, but not with words, just with presence, just with an aching heart that somehow felt both heavy and light at the same time. I prayed for Pope Francis, for the church, for every broken heart I had seen that day in the crowd. And somewhere deep inside me, a quiet certainty began to grow. This wasn't the end. Not really. His mission, his love, his final prayer, it was just beginning, now alive inside each of us who had witnessed it. Later that night, back in my hotel room, I sat by the window looking out over the dark rooftops of Rome. The city felt almost asleep, like it was cradling itself after a long day of weeping. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, the sunlight, the silence, the quiet strength in his frail frame. I knew deep in my bones that Pope Francis had given us more than a blessing that day. He had given us his final offering, his final prayer, and somehow he had poured all of himself into it without needing to say a single word. As the hours stretched on, news began to trickle through the city. Whispers at first, and then confirmation. Pope Francis had passed away later that evening, surrounded by only a few trusted aides and the soft prayers of the faithful rising into the Roman night. I sat there frozen, the words blurring on the screen of my phone as my heart broke quietly inside my chest. Even though I had known it was coming, even though we had all felt it in the air that morning, hearing the news made it final in a way that silence alone had not. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, letting the weight of it settle around me like a heavy blanket. I thought back to the way he had looked out over us, the way he had blessed us with hands that shook but did not falter. I thought about the peace on his face, the glow of the morning sun catching the edges of his white robes. And I thought about the prayer he must have whispered when he knew the time had finally come. Not a cry for rescue, but a whisper of gratitude. A simple thank you for a life spent in service, for a journey walked in faith even to the very last breath. In that darkness, I realized that death had not stolen him away. It had simply carried him home. The next morning, the city woke to a strange, tender quiet. Bells tolled across Rome, slow and steady, as if the very stones of the streets were mourning with us. People gathered again in the square without being asked, drawn there by something bigger than grief alone. It wasn't chaos, it wasn't panic. It was love, pure, raw, aching love for a man who had given everything he had until there was nothing left but spirit. I stood among them once more, looking up at the balcony where he had stood just a day before. The curtains were closed now, the window still, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like he was still there, watching over us, praying for us the way he had always done. Around me, strangers held hands, whispered prayers, wiped silent tears from their cheeks. No one wanted to leave. We stayed, not because we were told to, but because being near that sacred place brought us closer to the man who had shown us what real faith looked like. Later that week, I visited a small garden behind one of the basilicas, a place Pope Francis was said to have loved during his quieter moments. I found a stone bench beneath a blooming olive tree and sat there, letting the breeze move gently around me. I closed my eyes and whispered my own small prayer, hoping it would reach wherever he was now. Not a prayer asking for miracles, not a desperate cry, just a simple thank you. Thank you for showing us that faith isn't about grandeur or perfection, but about presence, about loving others even when it hurts, even when the whole world is watching. As the days passed, the world moved forward the way it always does after loss, but something inside me had shifted forever. Every mass I attended, every prayer I whispered, carried a little more weight, a little more meaning. I found myself seeing people differently, loving them more freely, forgiving faster, praying deeper. It was as if the final blessing Pope Francis had given us wasn't just a moment in time, but a seed planted in our hearts, growing quietly, steadily, without us even realizing it. His death wasn't an end. It was a beginning for all of us who had been touched by his life. I think about that Easter weekend often. I think about the feeling in the air, the sacredness of the silence, the fragile strength in the way he lifted his hands one last time. And when the days feel long and heavy, when the weight of the world tries to press down on me, I remember that moment. The sunlight on his face, the crowd holding its breath, the whisper of hymns in the Roman wind. I remember that faith doesn't always shout. Sometimes it stands trembling on a balcony, says nothing, and still speaks louder than anything else in the world. My name is Matthew Rinaldi, and this is the story of how Pope Francis's final prayer changed my life forever. If his story moved you even a fraction as much as it moved me, I invite you to take a moment now, like he did, to be still, to be grateful, and to carry that light forward in your own life. Please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more real stories of faith, and share this with someone who might need a little extra hope today. Thank you for listening, and God bless you.